Hello again, Jared Pitts here, and today I'm going to be reading another article by Dr. Ray Peat. This one, again, can be found on his website, raypeat.com, and this one is called Progesterone, Not Estrogen, is the Coronary Protection Factor of Women. And before I get into this article, just wanted to remind you I have a link in the description of this video for my website, MissouriHealthCoach.com. And if you are needing any help in your health journey, you can go ahead and set up a free 15-minute consultation on that website, and then we'll see what we can do going from there. Also, I have a couple of links in the description for discount codes for a couple of companies that I really appreciate, Health Natura and Life Giving Store, and for products like their aspirin, vitamin K, vitamin D, desiccated thyroid, Cascara sagrada, and other things that Dr. Peat talked about using. Okay, let's get into the article. In the 1940s, around the time that Hans Selye was reporting that estrogen causes shock and that progesterone protects against many stress-related problems, the anthropologist Ashley Montagu published The Natural Superiority of Women. Later, as I looked at the history of endocrine research, it seemed apparent that progesterone was responsible for many of the biological advantages of females, such as a longer average lifespan, while testosterone was responsible for men's advantage in muscular strength. Although evidence of estrogen's toxicity had been accumulating for decades, pharmaceutical promotion was finding hundreds of things to treat with estrogen, which they called the quote-unquote female hormone. By the 1940s, it was known to produce excessive blood clotting, miscarriage, cancer, age-like changes in connective tissue, premenstrual syndrome, varicose veins, orthostatic hypotension, etc. But, as Mark Twain said, a lie can run around the world before the truth gets its boots on. Right, and this is just at the root of every bad argument that people make out there, right? When you see people debating politics and religion, and you see when logic is used, and the person that does not have reasoning and logic, they resort to association, right? Trying to make you guilty by association, whether they associate you with the conservative party or the liberal party, or associate you with the Crusades or whatever it might be, right? They can just call this thing estrogen, the female hormone, right? And they've associated it with the essence of being female, and now all of a sudden, they can use it however they want, right? But then when you dig in using logic and reason, right, you can't get around these things that it causes. Okay, moving on. After the DES fiasco, and this is, I believe, diethylstilbestrol or something along those lines, and you can read more on that. I'm not sure how deep he's going to get into that quote-unquote fiasco here, but okay, after the DES fiasco, in which the quote-unquote female hormone, which had been sold to prevent miscarriages, was proven to cause them, the estrogen industry decided to offer men the protection against heart attacks that women supposedly got from their estrogen. The men who received estrogen in the study had an increased incidence of heart attacks, so that campaign was postponed for about 30 years. The Schutz used vitamin E to treat the excessive blood clotting caused by estrogen, and vitamin E was considered to be an estrogen antagonist. Estrogen affected the liver's production of clot-regulating proteins, and it also relaxed large veins, allowing blood pooling that slowed the blood sufficiently to give it time to form clots before returning to the lungs. And I believe this is where varicose veins comes from, right? Your veins in your legs a lot of the time pulling blood because of those relaxed veins, right? Early in the century, unsaturated fats were found to inactivate the proteolytic enzymes that dissolve clots, And vitamin E was known by the 1940s to provide protection against the toxicity of the unsaturated fats. The toxic synergy of estrogen and unsaturated fats had already been recognized. And this is why vitamin E has even been known to be called the fertility vitamin. And maybe he'll get into that here later. But in the 1950s, the seed oil industry, ignoring the toxic carcinogenic effects of the unsaturated oils, began intensified promotion of their products as beneficial foods. Decades earlier, Mark Twain had reported on the plans of the cottonseed industry to make people eat their byproduct instead of butter. While estrogen was being offered as the hormone that protects against heart attacks, the liquid vegetable oils were being advertised as the food that would prevent heart attacks. And I know Nina Teichels has a good talk on YouTube that kind of walks through the whole history of how it became known, PUFAs became known as this quote-unquote heart protective fat. Just a few years after the estrogen industry suffered the setbacks of the DES and heart attack publicity, the oil industry canceled some tests of the quote-unquote heart protective diet because it was causing both more heart attacks and more cancer deaths. Somehow these two fetid streams converged. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Fetid, F-E-T-I-D. Okay, and this is in bold. Estrogen, like the unsaturated oils, lowered the amount of cholesterol in the blood. And that's the end of the bolded statement. Okay, and an excess of blood cholesterol was said to cause heart attacks. And more recently, the estrogenic effects of the seed oils are claimed to offer protection against cancer. The ability to lower the cholesterol quote-unquote risk factor for heart attacks became a cultural icon, so that the contribution of estrogen and unsaturated oils to the pathologies of clotting could be ignored. Likewise, the contribution of unsaturated fats lipid peroxidation to the development of atherosclerotic plaques was simply ignored. But one of the estrogen's long-established toxic effects, the reduction of tone in veins, was turned into something like a quote-unquote negative risk factor. The relaxation of blood vessels would prevent high blood pressure and its consequences in this new upside-down paradigm. And then this last sentence in this paragraph is in bold, so important here. This vein dilating effect of estrogen has been seen to play a role in the development of varicose veins, in orthostatic hypotension, and in the formation of blood clots in the slow-moving blood in the large leg veins. When it was discovered that the endothelial relaxing factor was nitric oxide, a new drug business came into being. Nitroglycerin had been in use for decades to open blood vessels, and ignoring the role of nitrite vasodilators in the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, new drugs were developed to increase the production of nitric oxide. The estrogen industry began directing research toward the idea that estrogen works through nitric oxide to quote-unquote improve the function of blood vessels and the heart. And where you also see this all the time is with the beetroot powder. So why does the beetroot powder lower, quote-unquote, lower blood pressure, right? A lot of people in the natural world are trying to do this the quote-unquote natural way, but what are beets extremely high in? And it's essentially nitric oxide, right? So it's the same route, but just doing it in a quote-unquote natural way. And this is the same as there being nitrates in meat, right? The organic side, instead of putting in a controlled amount of nitrates, they do this celery powder. And what is this celery powder? But essentially, because you know celery is mostly water, so they just saturate the ground around the celery that they grow for this in nitrates, and it takes it up, and then they take that celery and they dehydrate it and grind it up, and once the water's gone, what's left? Well, it's the nitrates. But it's not as controlled as if they were to just use nitrate powder, right? They can actually control that when they add it intentionally. Not that the celery powder isn't intentionally. Anyway, Dr. Peat has talked about that, how getting celery powder really caused some issues for him. Anyway, it's just two sides of the same coin in a lot of these situations, right? Besides the argument based on quote-unquote risk factors, many people cite the published observations that, quote, women who take estrogen are healthier, end quote, than women who don't use it. But studies showed that their quote-unquote control groups consisted of women who weren't as healthy to begin with. In the 1970s, after reading Szent-Györgyi's description of the antagonistic effect of progesterone and estrogen on the heart, I reviewed the studies that showed that progesterone protects against estrogen's clotting effect. I experimented with progesterone, showing that it increases the muscle tone in the walls of veins, which is very closely related to the effects Szent-Györgyi described in the heart. And progesterone opposes estrogen's ability to increase the amount of free fatty acids circulating in the blood. More recently, it has been discovered that progesterone inhibits the expression of the enzyme nitric oxide synthase. Okay, and you can hear it in the name, right? Nitric oxide synthase, synthesis, creation of nitric oxide, right? So that's what that enzyme would do. While estrogen stimulates its expression. So estrogen, in this amplification kind of way, right, it just creates even more of a problem, creating more nitric oxide via this enzyme. At the time of ovulation, when estrogen is high, a woman breathes out 50% more nitric oxide than men do, but at other times, under the influence of increased progesterone and thyroid and reduced estrogen, women exhale much less nitric oxide than men do. Nitric oxide is a free radical, and it decomposes into other toxic compounds, including the free radical peroxynitrile, which damages cells, including the blood vessels, brain, and heart. Carbon dioxide tends to inhibit the production of peroxynitrile. And this is one of those devices that I have on my wish list. But you can get a device, I think they sell them on Amazon, which is a nitric oxide detector, kind of like a carbon monoxide detector. And you could just breathe into this thing to kind of get a good idea of what's going on inside your body, right? You breathe into it and you see how much nitric oxide you're emitting. Anyway, that's on my wish list. Maybe someday. If nitric oxide produced under the influence of estrogen were important in preventing cardiovascular disease, then men's larger production of nitric oxide would give them greater protection than women have. For more realistic perspectives, nitric oxide is being considered as a cause of aging, especially brain aging. And this is in bold. Nitric oxide interacts with unsaturated fats to reduce oxygen use, damage mitochondria, and cause edema. I think we can begin to see that the various quote-unquote heart protective ideas that have been promoted to the public for 50 years are coming to a dead end, and that a new look at the fundamental problems involved in heart disease would be appropriate. Basic principles that make heart disease more understandable will also be useful for understanding shock, edema, panic attacks, high-altitude sickness, high blood pressure, kidney disease, some lung diseases, MS, multiple organ failure, and excitotoxicity or quote-unquote programmed cell death of the sort that causes degenerative nerve diseases and deterioration of other tissues. The research supporting this view is remarkably clear, but it isn't generally known because of the powerful propaganda coming from the drug and oil industries and their public servants. Broda Barnes was right when he said that the quote-unquote riddle of heart attacks was solved when he demonstrated that hypothyroidism caused heart attacks, and that they were prevented by correcting hypothyroidism. He also observed that correcting hypothyroidism prevented the degenerative conditions, including heart disease, that so often occur in diabetics. Since hypothyroidism and diabetes are far more frequent in women who have fewer heart attacks than men, it is appropriate to wonder why women tolerate hypothyroidism better than men. In hypothyroidism and diabetes, respiration is impaired, and lactic acid is formed even at rest, and relatively little carbon dioxide is produced. To compensate for the metabolic inefficiency of hypothyroidism, adrenaline and noradrenaline are secreted in very large amounts. Adrenaline causes free fatty acids to circulate at much higher levels, and the lactic acid, adrenaline, and free fatty acids all stimulate hyperventilation. The already deficient carbon dioxide is reduced even more, producing respiratory alkalosis. Free fatty acids, especially unsaturated fats, increase permeability of blood vessels, allowing proteins and fats to enter the endothelium and smooth muscle cells of the blood vessels. Lactic acid itself promotes an inflammatory state, and in combination with reduced CO2 and respiratory alkalosis, contributes to the hyponatremia or sodium deficiency that is characteristic of hypothyroidism. This sodium deficiency in osmotic dilution causes cells to take up water, increasing their volume. And this just goes to show how all of these things are connected, right? People think that their edema is disconnected from their fatigue, and that's disconnected from, insert symptom here. But when it comes down to it, a lot of these things will find their basis in this simple metabolic deficiencies, the inability to create energy effectively and appropriately. And that's why a lot of the people talking in the quote-unquote repeat sphere are called pro-metabolic, right? What does that mean? They're just talking about how to increase your metabolic efficiency, how to increase your metabolic activity. Because if you can heal your metabolism, right? Anytime I say that, I think of Kate Deering and her book, How to Heal Your Metabolism. But if you can heal your metabolism, then you're going to see an alleviation of symptoms. And not only that, but everything in life, right? How we perceive things comes down to health, right? When we see something beautiful, a lot of the time, and it might be generational health that is resulted in a beautiful human, right? And so why do humans think particular things about other humans are beautiful? Well, most likely, outside of cultural intervention and unrealistic expectations, we are built to see and understand what health looks like, right? Even down to how, they talk about people being able to smell health, right? Being more attractive at a level which maybe we can't put our finger on it, but at a deeper level that our spidey sense can pick up on. Okay, but what you're doing now in your health journey, healing your metabolism, is going to affect your future children, grandchildren, etc., etc. And you're putting a stop to this generational, at this point, it's a generational metabolic deficiency, most likely. And you are just reaping the consequences, but you can turn it around. Okay, moving on. In hyperventilation, the heart's ability to work is decreased, and the work it has to do is increased because peripheral resistance is increased, raising blood pressure. Okay? And I just did a post on carbon dioxide, so this is really cool to read. But almost everyone is hyperventilating, and this is why I love the Buteyko method so much, because it helps people to stop hyperventilating, and it requires this intervention on your part, because depending on how long you've been metabolically deficient, it's now almost habit in your body to hyperventilate. But you can actively intervene in that so that you are not hyperventilating all the time and expelling too much carbon dioxide. Even in this article, we've read a lot about the protective effects of carbon dioxide. One component of peripheral resistance is the narrowing of the channels in blood vessels caused by endothelial swelling. And so you can imagine in a blood vessel, the lining, the outside, the endothelial part, if it swells, it's shrinking down the available space for that blood to flow through, right? In the heart, a similarly waterlogged state makes complete contraction and complete relaxation impossible. Estrogen itself intensifies all of these changes of hypothyroidism, increasing permeability and edema, and decreasing the force of the heartbeat, impairing the diastolic relaxation. Besides its direct actions and synergism with hypothyroidism, estrogen also chronically increases growth hormone, which causes chronic exposure of the blood vessels to higher levels of free fatty acids, with a bias toward unsaturated fatty acids, and promotes edema and vascular leakage. Hyperestrogenism, like hypothyroidism, tends to produce dilution of the body fluids and is associated with increased bowel permeability, leading to endotoxemia. Both dilution of the plasma and endotoxemia impair heart function. And you could spend, a month unpacking that paragraph right there. But again, it just all comes together. It is all connected. And, why does it say that there's a bias towards unsaturated fatty acids when they're released into our bloodstream? Well, it's because we burn the saturated ones preferentially. And then the unsaturated ones get stored because they're not wanted, essentially. And so it's like, all right, maybe someday when we're in a famine, I'll use that. But preferentially, our body wants to burn these saturated fats so that when we go through whatever stress it might be, it's the unsaturated fats that are getting released, which are causing further inflammation. Progesterone's effects are antagonistic to estrogens. Progesterone decreases the formation of nitric oxide, decreasing edema. It strengthens the heartbeat by improving venous return and increasing stroke volume. Right? Stroke volume, the amount of blood that can get pushed through every stroke of the heart. But at the same time, it reduces peripheral resistance by relaxing arteries, by inhibiting calcium entry, but also by other effects, and independently of the endothelium, and decreasing edematous swelling. The effects of progesterone on the heart and blood vessels are paralleled by those of carbon dioxide. Here it is in bold. Increased carbon dioxide increases perfusion of the heart muscle, increases its stroke volume, and reduces peripheral resistance. The physical and chemical properties of carbon dioxide that I have written about previously include protective anti-excitatory and energy-sustaining functions that explain these effects. Since these effects have been known for many years, I think it is obvious that the obsessive interest in explaining these functions in terms of other molecules such as nitric oxide is motivated by the desire for new drugs, not by a desire to understand the physiology with which the researchers are pretending to deal. Although women, because of estrogen's antithyroid actions, are much more likely to suffer from hypothyroidism than men are, until menopause they have much higher levels of progesterone than men do. The effects of hyperestrogenism and hypothyroidism with lower carbon dioxide production are offset by high levels of progesterone. After menopause, women begin to have heart attacks at a rapidly increasing rate. During the years that men are beginning to have a considerable risk of heart attacks, with declining thyroid function indicated by lower T3, their testosterone and progesterone are declining, while their estrogen is rising. Men who have heart attacks have much higher levels of estrogen than men at the same age who haven't had a heart attack. Whether the issue is free radical damage, vascular permeability with fat deposition, vascular spasm, edema, decreased heart efficiency, or blood clotting, the effects of chronic estrogen exposure are counter-adaptive. Progesterone, by opposing estrogen, is universally protective against vascular and heart disease. And that last sentence was in bold. So far, the rule in most estrogen/progesterone research has been to devise experiments so that claims of benefits can be made for estrogen, with the expectation that they will meet an uncritical audience. In some studies, it's hard to tell whether idiocy or subterfuge is responsible for the way the experiment was designed and described. For example, when synthetic chemicals with anti-progesterone activity are described as quote-unquote progesterone. Since one estrogen-funded researcher who supposedly found progesterone to be ineffective as treatment for premenstrual syndrome, practically admitted to me in conversation an intent to mislead. I think it is reasonable to discount idiocy as the explanation for the tremendous bias in published research. With the vastly increased resources in the estrogen industry resulting from the product promotion, quote, for the prevention of heart disease, end quote, I think we should expect the research fraud to become increasingly blatant. Rather than being quote-unquote heart protective, estrogen is highly heart toxic. And it is this that makes its most important antagonist, progesterone, so important in protecting the heart and circulatory system. And as usual, a ton of resources at the bottom that you guys can read on your own time. Just an absolutely fantastic article. I feel like it hit everything that Dr. Peat typically talks about: progesterone, estrogen, nitric oxide, carbon dioxide, PUFA, vitamin E, and the big one, corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, God bless.